The early 2000s flew by fast, really fast. The racing genre was firing on all cylinders. 2 decades later, it's interesting to revisit and assess which of these games have stood the test of time and still fulfill that need for speed. However, there's one specific retro racing game that I always end up revisiting time and time again, and that's F-ZEROGX. Released in 2003 for the GameCube, I think F-ZEROGX might be the greatest arcade racing game ever made. F-ZEROGX holds up incredibly well compared to its competitors from the time, and even many more modern racing games. So in this video, let's explore and compare why F-Zero is a masterful experience that was ahead of its time, and why it still holds up so well even today. Please consider subscribing to support the channel if you like the content, and let's race. Now, all the footage from every game shown in this video was captured on original hardware using component cables and an analog to digital signal converter. No emulators were used. And that's important because the most obvious strength of F-ZEROGX is its visual presentation. F-Zero is a truly stunning GameCube game, easily one of the very best looking titles of that generation. It delivers a timeless, stylized look across its many tracks, but somehow that style still feels grounded in reality. Tracks are highly detailed, alive, and massive, and they all still look great. The catchy and memorable music throughout also gives each environment more personality. One major reason F-Zero holds up so well visually is that it implements the Triforce of GameCube graphics, which means 60 frames per second, progressive scan mode, and widescreen support. Many GameCube games implement one or two of these, but very few implement all three, and that's true of competing systems as well. F-Zero delivers almost shockingly high image quality on the original GameCube hardware. To put things in perspective, let's explore some comparisons between competing games from the time, such as titles from the Extreme and Wipeout series, two of my other favorite racing franchises, and these were all captured using the same setup. Now, I want to stress that I actually really enjoy every game series featured in this video, but when I revisit competing titles from the same time period, I find that most fall short of F-ZEROGX in terms of presentation and polish, even if they're still fun to play. So for example, if we look at this forest and water themed level from Extreme G Racing, although it looks good for the time, it's also a bit simplistic or visually primitive by today's standards. If we directly compare that footage to a thematically similar level from F-Zero, the two games look almost a generation apart in my opinion, or maybe some sort of half step between generations, such as the Dreamcast step up from the N64 and PS1. The same can be said for this desert level. Although it looks fine in Extreme G Racing, it's very static and a little bit bland. There isn't much environmental detail or action beyond the racetrack itself. If we directly compare that to a desert level from F-Zero, GX clearly pulls ahead with richer environments. This even applies to the intro cinematics to the different tracks. For example, the camera pans in Extreme G Racing showcase fairly simplistic visual presentation with blocky visuals. When compared with an intro in F-ZEROGX, the difference really is pretty staggering. Now you might be thinking, well, Extreme G Racing came out 2 years earlier as a launch title, that's not a fair comparison. But the same holds true for Extreme G Racing Association, the sequel that launched slightly after F-ZEROGX. I think the sequel is actually weaker in terms of driving mechanics and gameplay, but the visuals are arguably a bit better, or at least more detailed. However, the graphics still look a little bit murky and lack clarity or the level of detail we see in F-Zero. For instance, this outer space level is interesting enough for the time, but when we switch over to F-Zero, the outer space level there is again much more impressive. The environments just look more natural and detailed with better clarity and visibility. The same holds true for competing Wipeout games from the time. Wipeout Fusion is probably one of the less popular entries in the franchise, but it's also the series' closest competitor to GX in terms of release date and hardware, having been released for the PS2 in 2002. If we cut back and forth here between these two games, you can see that Fusion looks much more simplistic and the image quality is worse. I think Wipeout Fusion has actually aged pretty badly in terms of visuals on the original hardware, and some of the track designs are just murky and not very interesting. This is odd because the Wipeout games for PlayStation 1 were impressive for the time, and the Wipeout content for later generations is visually stunning, more on that later. Now, we're mostly comparing against other sci-fi arcade racers here, but I think F-Zero is also more impressive than most other racing games of the time in general. And the 2000s actually had a lot of great-looking racing games relative to the hardware. For example, here is Need for Speed Most Wanted 2, which released within a year of GX across platforms. Although I think Most Wanted 2 is a decent-looking game, the overall visual presentation is somewhat simplistic or bland in comparison. Even more realistic-looking games like this still need a little bit of style to help them age better. Need for Speed Underground arrived a year later and did amp up the detail and style a bit, but the overall image quality is a bit grainy and it lacks that triforce of technical specs. F-ZEROGX just looks extremely clear and crisp when compared to these games, and its sense of speed is unrivaled. One other good-looking arcade racer from the time is Burnout 3 Takedown on the PS2, or really any of the later Burnout games. Burnout 3 is still fast and furious and smooth, with impressive collision and a lot going on. However, the image quality is still a bit grainy since it doesn't appear to support progressive scan, though I wasn't able to confirm this for certain. Gran Turismo 4 is also an impressive effort at the time, though obviously it's difficult to compare a realistic simulation game to a futuristic sci-fi racer. I'm not much of a simulation racing game person myself, but I appreciate what they accomplished on the PS2 hardware. What's really interesting is that I think F-ZEROGX almost looks closer to some more modern racers than it does to its legacy counterparts. For example, let's look at some comparisons to Fast RMX on the Switch, which is probably the closest thing we have to a modern F-Zero in terms of visuals and gameplay style. Now, even though the Switch is very dated hardware at this point, the system is still immensely more powerful than the GameCube. As we sort of cut back and forth here between thematically similar tracks, I think it's interesting to see how well F-Zero still holds up against a modern counterpart. I think GX is actually a little bit more stylistically interesting and memorable, even if it falls short in fidelity, obviously. Some of the fast tracks are just a little bit generic in terms of design and background imagery when compared to F-Zero. Now obviously there are modern sci-fi racers that look far more realistic and higher fidelity than F-Zero. For example, the Wipeout Omega collection available on PS4 and PS5 looks absolutely beautiful. In fact, I think the Omega collection might be the most visually impressive sci-fi racer to date, at least in terms of my personal preferences and taste. The clarity and quality of the visuals is really impressive. After the PS2 generation, the Wipeout series became something of a graphical showcase for various Sony systems. Flashout 3 is another decent modern sci-fi racer that has a lot to offer. I personally had a hard time getting into this one because I find the overemphasis on combat too distracting from the actual racing, but I'm sure many other people enjoy it. Although Flashout is a good-looking game, this is another instance where the importance of art style surfaces. Flashout is obviously higher fidelity than F-Zero, but I think the F-Zero tracks are still stylistically more interesting. For example, this sort of tree and water level again looks pretty good in Flashout, but the similar level in F-Zero just has so much more life and energy to it. And I think that also applies to this fire track and a comparison going back and forth here as well. Redout 2 is another quality sci-fi arcade racer for various platforms. Released in 2022, this game looks very good, but has more of a heavily stylized hyper sci-fi look to it. Now the footage captured here is from an RTX 4090 locked at 144 frames per second on the highest settings, which is a bit amusing to think about in comparison to the humble GameCube. You see, the GameCube is only capable of around 10 gigaflops of compute power, which is almost nothing by today's standards. The RTX 4090 is loosely capable of around 83 teraflops of shader power according to NVIDIA's website, which converts to 83,000 gigaflops against the GameCube's 10 gigaflops. Obviously, these are sort of silly and somewhat out of context comparisons. There's a lot more to graphics than just teraflops. But I just think it's interesting to ponder the increasingly diminished returns of graphical improvements in modern games relative to the massive increases in hardware power. I digress. Anyway, there are two other specific reasons that I personally think make F-Zero look so great. The first is the track surface itself. F-Zero almost never has you racing down a boring, plain surface. The road texture and surface changes constantly. One second you're driving down detailed metal grids or meshes, which turn into tubes of transparent glass, which turns into a tunnel of different metal plating, complete with strobing or pulsing lights and panels on them, and so on. Some tracks even have water running down the sides or other details. It's all just crazy. The track is always detailed and often lets you see what's going on beneath it, which allows the game to showcase even more details beneath you instead of what's just above or beyond the road. It's a unique and effective design choice. Second, I think F-Zero is just extremely good at blending and scaling foreground, midground, and background detail. We just discussed how detailed the track surfaces are, and they're usually lined with other small objects or details. Just beyond the tracks, there are usually large sci-fi structures, city buildings, large interesting tubes, floating ships or trees and plant life, or even monsters jumping out of the sand. Those details blend into very large yet detailed background elements, such as the lights of a cityscape beneath you on Mute City, or the giant rocky cliffs on the fire levels, or even the sun and stars in outer space. This all might sound obvious or like a given, but older generation 3D games are often bad at convincingly blending these levels of detail. GameCube games often intentionally avoid large, distant landscapes because they don't look great, but F-Zero showcases them constantly and somehow pulls it off. You can see this type of struggle in F-Zero's competitors. For example, this level in Extreme G-Racing just shows a simplistic concrete surface to race on in the area immediately around you, followed by several trees just sort of awkwardly stuck to the ground beyond the track, and then fairly blurry or undetailed rock surface further back. The trees in this opening cutscene do not look convincing at all, especially when you compare it to a scene in F-ZEROGX. For example, on this forest level, there's so much detail at every distance that it looks very natural and you don't even have to think about it until you play a game where that doesn't happen. Now we could talk all day about these visual comparisons, but it really doesn't matter what any of these games look like in 2024 if they don't feel great to play, and that's where I think F-ZEROGX finishes in first place. F-ZEROGX might be the most responsive racing game I've ever played. It's difficult to explain until you get your hands on it. The game seems to have almost zero input lag at all. Your ship is highly responsive and feels glued to the track in a good way. The slightest adjustments and nuances in control are captured perfectly on screen. Personally, I really don't like it when sci-fi racers are too floaty or drifty. Even if you're hovering, you should still have precise control over your ship, or it's just frustrating. F-Zero is one of the few arcade racers I've played, and especially sci-fi racers, where no matter how fast you're going, it still feels like you maintain complete control over your ship to effectively navigate the track. For example, complex levels like Big Blue or parts of Mute City are somehow totally manageable despite the fact that the levels have tons of hard right 90-degree angle turns in them. This would be totally unplayable in most racing games, yet somehow it's just second nature in F-Zero. GX creates this perfect symbiosis between the crisp, fast visuals, the nuanced controls, and the GameCube controller itself to deliver an almost perfect feeling racing game. The large A button provides thrust, with the tip of your thumb always resting on the Y button for constant boosting. The chunky shoulder buttons provide perfect pressure-sensitive air brakes to drift back and forth and finesse your turns. F-Zero has no weapons or combat systems or bloated mechanics or any other gameplay systems to really worry about. You can essentially play the game with 4 buttons and focus on speed and precision. F-ZEROGX captures the essence of that old saying, easy to learn, difficult to master. I think GX can be enjoyed by casual gamers on the easiest settings of Grand Prix. You really can generally win by just going fast with A and boosting and steering with the joystick. However, to win on higher difficulties, you'll need to effectively use the air brakes for more advanced steering, and for the higher difficulties, it helps to master more advanced techniques such as quick turn and momentum throttling. These are the types of techniques that can keep you in control at any speed and keep you going fast. Some racing games really struggle with this. For example, I think the gameplay in Fast RMX sort of falls apart at the highest speeds, where something about the controls and the track design don't mesh very well and your ship becomes really hard to manage. The ship stats in F-ZEROGX also follow this same pattern. Novice or casual players can just jump in and select Captain Falcon or their favorite colored ship and zoom away. However, more experienced players can tinker around with the many different racers, each of which have their own feel and playstyle to see what they prefer. And if that's not enough, there's a surprisingly robust custom shipbuilding system through unlockable parts and components. You can tune the look and feel of up to 4 custom ships and race them across the Grand Prix races. I think this masterful gameplay and control is what really keeps F-ZEROGX fun to this day. It's just a bonus that it happens to still look great. F-Zero is easy to jump into years after not playing it for a while due to the simplicity of the controls, while leaving plenty of room for mastery. Now there's one huge caveat here though, and that's the story mode. Yes, F-Zero includes a sort of odd story mode that plays out across 9 missions, complete with cheesy CGI cutscenes before and after each one to tell a fragmented story. And for some reason the music is about 10 times louder than the dialogue in each one.
That's a fine-looking machine you're driving, Falcon.
Some of these story mission challenges are actually fairly interesting in terms of gameplay, but if there's one fatal flaw in F-ZEROGX, it's that the story mode is absolutely brutal and does not scale difficulty well at all. Although the higher difficulty levels of the Grand Prix modes are also intense, most players will still be able to win and enjoy the races on the novice and standard difficulties. The story mode is not as accommodating. Standard mode is still extremely difficult, but most experienced F-Zero players will probably be able to complete it with practice and dedication. However, the hard and very hard modes are just out of control in terms of difficulty, and I suspect most players will never be able to complete them. Even the very first mission is extremely difficult. So what are your thoughts on F-ZEROGX? Is it one of the best racing games ever, or is it just very overrated? What's your favorite racing game of all time? Please consider subscribing, leave a comment, and let's discuss.